Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was James Vincent McMorrow with We Don't Eat. Now, on today's show, I'm going to be talking about a study that has to do with eating, as you might have imagined. And originally, this was not my plan. I was actually going to do a news recap and think about some recent science things that have happened. But as I was compiling a list of potential topics to discuss, I found this one particular news item that got a bit of attention, so you might have seen it somewhere in the press. And I was really curious about it, so I tracked down the original paper from the original academic journal, and I read it. And I actually, as I was reading it, I thought that this is the sort of thing that listeners would probably find quite intriguing, if they're like me anyway, because it has to do with a charismatic species doing some interesting behaviors in places that are impacted by humans with potential effects for the whole ecosystem, the whole landscape. So there's actually quite a lot of complexity to this study, even though it's pretty straightforward and easy to understand. So the methodologies were pretty simple, but the potential implications are more complex. And it was just kind of a nice thing. So I thought I'll do one more show looking into a specific paper in detail, and then next week I'll look around at the news and give more of a rundown across the different disciplines, and we'll do some different topics there. So this particular paper is one that focuses on mountain lions, or pumas, or any number of other names that you might call them. This is actually the species that has more common names than pretty much any other species that is known. And these guys are actually my favorite of the cat species, and I know it sounds like kind of a silly thing to have a list of, but having gone to Africa and seen leopards and lions and cheetahs, I haven't seen tigers yet, because that requires going to India, and we went to India once and didn't have any luck. So I haven't seen all of these guys out in the wild, but there's something about pumas that I find just really intriguing, because they're very athletic and they're quite large, and yet they just can disappear into human habitats, and they live in really close proximity with humans in the western portion of the U.S. in particular. And that's actually true of a lot of wild cat species. They tend to be really good at sneaking around human habitats and just disappearing. But pumas are particularly good at that and can use really tiny little patches of land. But this recent study suggests that actually, even though they're doing this, they might be adjusting their behaviors in a way that makes them kind of have a different impact on the landscape, and maybe adapt in certain ways that aren't necessarily very good for them over the long run. So that's why I found this study to be really intriguing. Now, if you've listened to the show in the past, you know that I am quite interested in anthropogenic disturbances, and we know that these sorts of things, whether they are through sound or through chemical pollutants or physical events that happen, they can cause changes to the dynamics of wildlife communities, to what species are doing, how species interact, how the ecosystem then functions. One of the things that they can do is drive the loss of native species or introduce novel species, and they can even artificially enhance populations of a particular species. And this is particularly true of generalists, so species that are quite good at just utilizing lots of resources and lots of habitats, and so therefore tend to be a bit more adaptable and happy to work with change. Now, in order to explore these sorts of impacts of human disturbances, we usually focus on quantifying a population size or the presence or absence of a particular species. And you'll know from having listened to some of my other diatribes on how this research should be done, that this isn't necessarily the best thing. You can miss out on a lot of details if you're just counting numbers and not really looking at the underlying behaviors that the animals that represent those numbers might actually be engaging in, or looking at the processes in those environments. And actually, changes in behaviors can be quite noticeable or very subtle, depending on what sorts of things you're looking at. But regardless, they can have really far-reaching implications. We know that if you change your behavior, you might be impacting your own health, you might be impacting your fitness, and by fitness here I mean the biological definition of that, so how many offspring you can produce and how many offspring they produce, and so on and so forth, so passing on your genes to the next generation. It can also affect species elsewhere in the food web, so if one individual animal starts going to different places or utilizing the habitat in a different way, then suddenly other species that were dependent on those known behaviors that have now changed will be impacted as well. And this can have larger repercussions because it will echo throughout the food web and therefore potentially affect the community, the ecosystem, and even the landscape. And that can be noticeable at lots of different levels, and even to us humans, we can see these things happening, and we can be affected by these things as well. So for example, if you've got things that impact shellfish, like mussels, that are really good filter feeders and will clean out the water system. If something impacts them and suddenly they aren't around in very large numbers, or they aren't behaving quite the same way, then the waters might be dirtier, they might not be useful for certain things we were using before, we might have to put more chemicals to treat the water, and so on and so forth. And those are really obvious things that we'll notice. So this is something that doesn't just impact wildlife, which is important enough as it is, but can also impact humans. Now, large carnivores are known to be particularly sensitive to human disturbances, and that's because they have slow life cycles, so it takes them a long time to reproduce and to get their young up to an age where it's less likely that they're going to die. So often they have really high mortality at young ages, and so you have to go through a couple of years with the mother taking care of the offspring before they're kind of in a state when you know that they're more likely to survive and go on to reproduce their own young. They also tend to need lots of space, and that's because they have prey that are fairly large, or they may have prey that roam around a lot, and so they need to be able to have a large area of space in which those prey will be found, so that they have that food resource. We also have a tendency to directly persecute these animals, and these guys tend to avoid human-dominated areas. Now, I said that certain cats tend to be really good. I mean, leopards are famous for this in Africa. There are farmers who have leopards that will regularly take their goats or their sheep or their small livestock, and yet they never see these animals. So we know that some of them really will just go literally hide in the hills, but others will kind of slink around human areas but try to avoid human contact. So whatever level of avoidance there is, they're usually, these are not things that tend to be really obvious in the habitat, just lounging around in the way that maybe a robin would or a squirrel would out in the garden or out on the street. So we know that reductions in the density and occupancy rates of large carnivores can have these kind of cascading effects on the ecosystem. And one of the things that's been documented is the release of what we call mesopredators. So things that are kind of, they're not little predators and they're not big predators. So they're not on the scale of a mink, but they're also not on the scale of a lion, for example. They're in between, so something like a coyote or a fox. And these things would compete for some of the same resources, whether they're killing the same things or whether they're eating carcasses or just sharing space. So if you've got something like, in this case, a mountain lion that would be taken out of the habitat, then things like coyotes are going to do much better, and they're going to go in and do more predation than they might have otherwise. And this can cause a lot of problems because they might target different things, they might target things at different rates, they might be a bit more aggressive in how they do it. There may be more of them, so there do tend to be, for example, more coyotes than mountain lions, and so they would go in and kind of have a population boom and take over a bit. So there can be lots of problems when this happens. And we've documented this in the U.S. in particular. I've actually read an article recently that's going to be published in a magazine that I help edit, and it was all about the difficult relationships in North America between wolves and coyotes and some of the smaller prey, and how they have these interlocking population cycles where as one kind of grows, the other will kind of go down. There might be booms and busts that can be really problematic in a local area because these things can take over the habitat. However, so that's one option, but another option is that these animals will change their behavior. So we might not have carnivores being taken out of the habitat, but instead adjusting how they interact with other species in the habitat and how they use the habitat that humans have disturbed. And this really hasn't been documented very well in terms of how these sorts of changes in behavior, if they exist, would go on to impact the whole community. And one potentially really interesting behavior to focus on is hunting and foraging, because these are very costly behaviors for carnivores. They have to go out and do a lot of of tracking to find the prey item that they're interested in. Once they found it, they have to stalk it. Once they do that, they have to go in for the kill, and they might have to run quite a distance. They might have to really put a lot of energy into taking it down and making the actual kill, and only then do they get a chance to eat it. And even then they have to potentially carry it off so that it's somewhere safe, or they have to eat it fast enough that other things around them aren't going to come in and try to steal it away, or they aren't going to be found by humans, or if it's been along the roadside, they're not going to be hit by a car, or any number of other things that might distract them and prevent them from eating that animal. Now, we tend to assume that hunting and foraging behaviors are optimized so that the animals are going to get the most energy for the least amount of effort. And that might be true in the wild. On average, you might see this happening in kind of pristine natural areas, but certainly in areas that are human-dominated or disrupted by humans, there might actually be deviations. And when you see deviations from the expected energy expenditure, what this might indicate is that the hunters are perceiving some sort of risk in the environment, and so they're trying to play it safe, and they are protecting themselves a little bit. And this might actually be to their own detriment, because they could be wasting energy in the amount that they're expending, but then also they might not be getting enough in terms of taking it back in after the kill has been made. So that means that something can be energetically expensive in the short term, but be perceived by the animal as having a payoff over the long term because it's decreasing exposure or starvation or whatever. So they might be doing something at the moment, just having a quick little meal instead of eating their whole fill, that at the short term you think, why aren't you eating more? But the reason that they're doing that is because they think that it's going to be safer for them and preserve their health or their lifespan over the long term. And so you've got this kind of trade-off between now and later, and assessing what you can do on what time scale that will be best for you as an individual, and potentially also as a potential parent. You particularly see this in females. The females are kind of thinking, they know they have to have some offspring, or maybe they do have some offspring already that they're trying to take care of, and so they try to weigh up all of these things when they're making their decisions. So if we are going to have these sorts of trade-offs, then that would suggest that in high-risk habitats you would actually be able to observe these and potentially measure these in a foraging situation, so that you would see animals sacrificing efficient foraging behavior in favor of increased vigilance and also risk avoidance. So maybe they're not eating because they are retreating somewhere to kind of den up where it's a bit safer, or they're retreating somewhere where they can watch and make sure that nothing is coming to get them. So they're spending more time doing those things than actually eating the prey that they've taken down. And in fact, we do know from previous studies that in other animals, and particularly in these animals as well, perceived risk is inversely correlated with food intake. So in other words, time spent consuming food will reflect the amount of fear that's experienced by the forager. So if you are more fearful in your environment, maybe because it's more disturbed, you're going to spend less time eating because you're going to be spending more time looking around and trying to assess what's going on and whether or not you're safe. Now, we know also that top carnivores tend to kill large prey species that require a high energetic cost during the hunting stage, but then also provide high energy rewards during consumption. So in this case, you've got primarily ungulates, deer, that the puma are tracking down. And deer, of course, are quite good runners. They can go for a pretty good distance. They can sprint back and forth in zigzaggy patterns and throw off a puma. So there's quite a lot of chase that's happening there. And that can be quite a lot of energy that the cats have to put into that. But the deer is also pretty hefty, and so they can get a lot of meat at the end of that, and that's why it all works out. But carnivores are constrained by their gut capacity, so they can't eat an entire deer all in one sitting. That's practically the size of the puma itself, and that would be impossible. So what they do is they take down an animal like that, and then drag the carcass somewhere, usually where they can kind of tuck it away and hide it a little bit. So they'll eat a bit now, and then go off and digest a little while, and then come back and eat a bit more later, and do that as many times as they need until they've eaten it all up. And so what all of this boils down to is the idea that carnivores in disturbed areas might end up losing potential energy because they're not able to fully consume a carcass, and on top of this, they're having to do repeated hunting efforts in order to replace their lost carcasses. So they're spending more energy in the hunting, and they're getting less energy from the eating. And so this doesn't balance out, and you could end up with individuals that are unhealthy. They might be losing weight, or they just might not be able to be in optimal condition, and this would be especially hard on females that are also not only trying to take care of themselves, but they're young as well. So this could have implications for current health of individuals, but also future health of the whole population. And the current study was interested in exploring some of these ideas and looking at behavioral changes associated with perceived risk at kill sites that were placed along a disturbance gradient. So you've got areas that are quite natural with very low human densities, and areas that are much more disturbed and built up with much higher human densities. And they were able to look at puma behavior along this gradient and look at areas where they had taken down animals to figure out, were they spending more or less time at the kill along the different areas of the gradient. And their disturbance hypothesis was that where there were more human activities, this would displace the pumas more often, and so they would have a lower overall prey consumption time and also a higher overall rate of killing the animals. And I'm going to break quickly here for a song, and when I come back, we'll think about the methods, the very elegant methods that the researchers used to look at this. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight. That was 10,000 Maniacs with Eat for Two. Now, before the break, I was introducing the topic of today's show, which is a study about pumas out in California. And this study looked at whether animals in more disturbed areas were altering their feeding behaviors such that they were able to eat less food and were having to make more kills in order to have that amount of food that they needed to survive. So before the break, I gave some background about that, and now I want to think about what the researchers did to actually answer their research questions. So they performed their observations in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is this is in the Central Coast region of California. And in this area, they captured 30 pumas between 2008 and 2013. And they fitted these guys with GPS and radio telemetry collars, which allowed them to track the behavior of the animals over a fairly long period of time. So the collars were programmed to collect information every 4 hours, and this provided information on where the pumas were spending their time. And the idea behind this is that the animals, females and males have different sizes of home range, and they would kind of patrol their own home range and look for resources. And at some point they would find an animal and they would kill it, and then when they would kill it, they would have the carcass somewhere, and they would then spend more time in the area where that carcass is. So when they're just kind of roaming around looking for food, they would be in a range of different points, but then when they've actually made the kill, it would be in a particular spot where you would see their activities over several hours or even several days. And so they used computer software to look for groups of locations, to pinpoint where it was likely that these pumas were spending a lot of time because they had actually made a kill. And in particular, the criteria that they were looking for was, where did they find the animals within 100 meters of kind of a cluster of spots? So that cluster, the center of that cluster would be where they presumably had made the kill or had dragged the carcass after a kill. And where were they found within 6 days of appearing at another location in that same cluster? So it's not just a favorite spot because it's a nice den or it has a good water source, but they're likely to be coming back to it specifically because there is a carcass. And these are the two behaviors that seem to indicate this the most. So the researchers were able to visit clusters in order to find and identify evidence of a kill. And when they did that, they could record whether or not the carcass was present, what type of animal it was, and what the sex of the animal was, if possible. Obviously, with a carcass, there might not be too much left, so that might be difficult, but to whatever extent they could, they made all these identifications. And ultimately, they focused most on deer because deer are the primary prey in the study area, and they're also easier to accurately predict given the data that the researchers collected here. And by predict, what I mean is that these guys had to create a model to predict the kill sites from their data, and not just from where they felt subjectively that the pumas were spending a lot of their time. So they weren't able to ground-proof all of the thousands of entries that the GPS and telemetry collars were returning to them. So they went out to some subset and collected a lot of data that they were able to use to kind of categorize, this is what typically results when you've had a kill. These are the sorts of behaviors and the patterns that we would expect to see. And they can feed that into the computer model and then have the computer tell you, okay, for the rest of these points where I see that puma is spending its time, this is where I think there is an actual kill site, and this is stuff that I actually think is just noise and the puma's wandering around, or it just happens to be in the same spot because maybe it's a bit lazy or whatever. So they included several different variables within that model, and these were the number of night locations and the proportion of locations occurring at night. So those are two separate things, but they both are kind of looking after where the puma's spending their time in the evening, and are they spending more time in the evening in a location than they would otherwise. Also the length of site occupation, so was it more or less than 1 day. The distance of locations from the center of the cluster, or where the kill was suspected to be. Site fidelity, so the proportion of sites occurring within the cluster over the cluster duration. That's obviously showing that the pumas like that spot and are coming back to it again and again. And farthest distance traveled during a cluster period. So if they are at a kill, you wouldn't expect them to go too far, but sometimes they might wander off, maybe because they're looking for something else or because they feel particularly vulnerable at a kill site. So just thinking about how far and wide do they roam when they do have that kill site. So they used a simple model that was able to make these categorizations to assign each cluster as a kill site or a non-kill site. And again, that's because they couldn't visit every single one, so they used the data that they had to predict all these other places and therefore expand their data set beyond just the spots where they could actually access and go themselves. And this permits them to use the less subjective way to assess what the pumas were doing. So they could have just kind of looked at the patterns that they created from the visits and then manually assigned all of the other sites as being kill sites or not. But this is a nice way that's a bit more objective and probably a bit safer that way, because they're not applying their own assumptions and influencing the results in that way. So they investigated puma behavioral responses at the population level at 4 different levels of housing density. And this is within 150 meters of the predicted kill sites. And they used this buffer because that's the scale of development that's had previously been found to most impact puma hunting in this behavior. And I mean pumas hunting behavior rather than hunting of pumas. So the 4 different levels of housing density were no housing at all, rural housing, so up to 0.062 houses per hectare, exurban, which is 0.062 to 1.236 houses per hectare, and suburban, which is 1.236 up to just under 10 houses per hectare, and then beyond that it would be urban, and it's pretty rare to find pumas in an actual urban area. So they then constrained the response variables to only include behaviors that were expected to be associated with risk aversion. So this is things like the proportion of night locations, site fidelity, total duration of a cluster, farthest distance traveled during a cluster period, and also prey consumption time. And they calculated this as site fidelity times the duration of a cluster. So that's the idea that basically the more time you spend at that site and the length of time that you spend at that site, if you multiply those, that is going to give you an idea of how much time the animal is actually spending eating the thing that it had brought down. And this was something that was added to reflect the energetic gain that the puma could have received from its kill. So getting back all of the calories that it spent going out there and actually taking the deer down. And they tested these differences in behaviors at all of the predicted kill sites in the different housing density categories. Now, to determine kill rates, they calculated the total number of deer predicted to be killed by each puma. And this came from the information that was provided by the GPS clusters. So by providing the predicted number of kills by the total time each puma was actively collecting, they could then generate the annual kill rates of the deer by the puma. They also investigated sex-specific relationships between kill rates and average values for puma behavior for each individual animal. And then finally, they calculated housing density within each puma home range, and this was estimated by plotting spatial data and looking for usage patterns. And then they used the satellite imagery to look at photos of ranges and identify homes. And that was how they were able to calculate the number of houses per square kilometer. So all of this is quite simple. They're basically just pulling up these satellite images of the areas. They're plotting out where are their homes. They're plotting out where are the pumas spending their time. They're looking at where they're spending their time in little clusters where they've taken down the animals. And then they have looked at kind of behavioral values that are associated with those geographical pieces of information. So the behavioral things come from the readings that the GPS collars were giving them, so how often they were spending time in certain places and what time of day. And then they were able to throw all of this into some computer models and figure out, what type of space was each puma using? Did it differ from one puma to another? Did it differ across different housing densities? And what are the likely implications of all of these variables? Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Matrakeberg with Eat at Joe's. Now on today's show, and just in case you're only just now joining us, I'm talking about a recent study that looked at puma hunting behavior in human areas and looked at whether the pumas were changing the way they behaved in terms of taking down a kill and feeding at the kill site as there were different levels of human disturbance in the environment around them. And just before the break, I finished up describing the methodology used in the study, and now I want to look at the results. So the researchers found 703 clusters that they were able to field verify. And these clusters were areas where they saw the pumas spending quite a lot of time. So multiple GPS readings were coming from those single clusters. And so they were looking at whether or not these were likely to be areas where they actually took down an animal and were then feeding on the carcass. So 208 of them were classified as deer kill sites. 66 were non-deer kill sites, so other types of prey like raccoons, for example, and then 429 of them were non-kills, and a lot of these happened to be bed sites, so it's where the pumas were spending a lot of time, not because they were eating, but because they were sleeping. Now, the model that best predicted deer kills included data on night locations, length of duration at the site, the mean distance of locations from the cluster center, the proportion of locations occurring at night, and also site fidelity. So this was what they were able to use to figure out which areas were likely to be kill sites and which areas were likely to be used for other types of activities. And at predicted kill sites, female pumas had less site fidelity and shorter prey consumption, and this was seen as housing density increased. So, for example, in suburban habitat, female site fidelity was about a third lower, so 36% lower, and the farthest distance traveled was 31% higher, whereas prey consumption time was 42% lower than in areas without any housing. So there's a clear difference from the lowest end of the scale to the highest end of the scale in terms of how much females are sticking around the carcass after they've brought it down, and how far they're going whenever they leave it in between their feeds, and how much time they're actually spending eating the animal itself as opposed to taking off and doing other behaviors instead. So clearly the females here in these areas seem to be quite nervous about being in the proximity of large numbers of people, and so they are taking off, not really taking in all those calories that they should from their kill, and they're probably then having to take down more animals in order to make up the difference. Now, both males and females were more nocturnal, with increasing housing density at kill sites. And that makes a lot of sense because people aren't nocturnal, so the pumas are more active where the people are going inside and no longer are out in the habitat. Now, of course, these guys tend to be a bit nocturnal anyway, but the pumas in the dense areas were even more so. They were spending even more of their nighttime hours being really active. Now, males didn't show any responses to housing density in terms of time spent at the kill site, and when only confirmed kills were used for analysis, the same trends were found. However, this is not true for females. So the home ranges of females tended to be much smaller than those of males. So for example, 54 versus 163 hectares. And they also had more houses, so 26 for females versus 16 for males. Males had an average deer kill rate of 44 deer per year, whereas females had about 67. And male kill rates were not correlated with any variables of interest or home range housing density. So the males just kind of do whatever they do, no matter where they are. Females, however, they found that the kill rate was strongly positively related to the home range housing density. So the more houses, the higher the kill rate. And this is exactly what they predicted, because they thought that females in these areas would spend less time at each carcass, and so would have to have more carcasses to make up the difference to get the calories that they need. So in fact, females with the most dense home ranges killed about 36% more deer per year, or 81.2 animals, than females in the lowest portion of their sample. And these females had about 59.7, just about 60 deer per year. So that's a difference of 20 deer per year. And female kill rates were also negatively correlated with fidelity to kill sites. So there is this clear, or seemingly quite clear effect of human disturbance, in this case human housing density, on the activity of these animals. And in just a minute we'll talk about what that's likely to mean. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Vanessa May with Jazz Will Eat Itself. Now on today's show, I'm just wrapping up a discussion of a recent study about pumas, and pumas that are hunting in human-disturbed areas across the disturbance gradient. And as I just discussed, we found that there are differences in females and female behavior in areas that have more houses, and this suggests that the females are being potentially negatively impacted by the presence of people. So what does all of this mean, and why do we care about any of this? We know that the kill rates reported for males were pretty comparable to those that have been described by previous studies. So male pumas tend to kill anywhere from 35 to 47 ungulates per year, and that was approximately what was found here. So female kill rates are the things that were actually a bit more interesting, and they were clearly impacted by housing density. The overall rates were not unlike those that have been reported for solitary adults and also for those with kittens, so anywhere between 52 and 68 mule deer per year, depending on family status. And obviously, in this case, we might not be looking at exactly the same kill species or exactly the same area of pumas, but this is what they had to work with. These are the previous studies that have been done, so this is how they're able to make comparisons, and more or less it does look pretty similar. However, those previous estimates are pretty small relative to the rates that were seen among the females living in the densest areas here. And as I said before the break, that's something like 80 deer per year, or about 20 more on average than females that were in the less disturbed areas. So this suggests that development is significantly costing females that are living in these areas. Now, hunting deer is very energetically costly. They have to stalk and then subdue and then kill the animals, and these are all very challenging things, as I mentioned earlier. So an increase in having to do these behaviors is likely to have a negative impact on the animals living in those areas. They're going to be expending quite a lot of calories. They might also be making themselves very obvious when they're doing this stuff in the habitat, and so they're more likely to be seen by dogs or by people, and if people are out hunting, or if they have hunting dogs that they're going to set on them, or if there are going to be other competitors in the area. So some of this might even be happening where there are really aggressive coyote populations or wolves or other things that might be challenging the pumas at their kill. Then this could be quite problematic. And in fact, unpublished data indicate that adult survival of pumas isn't lower in developed habitats, but it doesn't mean that the individuals there aren't in poorer condition or suffering from decreases in reproductive success. Reproductive success because of this kind of disparity along the human density gradient. And anecdotally, the researchers know of at least one tagged female that was living in the most developed area who lost 3 litters over the course of their study. And one of these was actually abandoned because she just couldn't take care of them, and so she took off to preserve herself for later. And in less developed areas, they found females over the same period of time that also had 3 dens, and those females were all successful. And obviously this is not a statistically analyzable thing, but that is a pretty good sign that the females in the dense areas are facing quite a challenge to feed not only themselves but also their young, and so as a result they're not able to have as many kittens or to do as well when they do. Now, males were less impacted by the development, and their life histories tend to revolve around the defense of much larger territories, and this means that males could simply spend more time in less developed areas and also do their hunting there. And males tended also to spend less time at kill sites than females, and this is probably related to the fact that they're always on the move, because they always have to patrol and defend their home range boundaries via scent marking, and so they seem to just always leave their kill sites early. And this habit, this thing that they are already doing that the females don't tend to do, may just naturally reduce the likelihood that males would ever be disturbed during their feeds, and so this is not going to be a problem for them because it's what they would do anyway, regardless of human density. The lower housing densities of male territories are also suggesting that the males are showing avoidance behavior potentially at the landscape level rather than at the kill site scale. Sorry, I can't speak. So when they go out and they find the territory that they want, they seem to maybe be naturally gravitating towards areas that have fewer homes. And so they create a territory boundary that encompasses fewer homes. And potentially that's leaving the females, relegating them to spots where they are just in those more human-disturbed areas because that's where they can squeeze themselves in. But obviously that would be something that they would actually have to do a bit more research on to actually see what happens in the dynamics of choosing and maintaining the territories. The higher kill rates seen among females appear to be driven by reduced time feeding at kills, and therefore less food consumed and a greater need for more kills to make up the difference. And variations in deer activity and abundance are unlikely to explain these patterns because deer are actually easier to detect in more human-disturbed areas. And so if anything, you would expect that the deer here would be killed less often because they would be so obvious and so easy to pick off that the females could just grab them and then have their fill right there rather than having to go again and again and again because it's so difficult to hunt. That's not how that works. Now, in addition to impacting pumas, these changes to feeding behaviors could also have effects on the wider ecosystem. So by leaving more corpses and corpses with more meat, this could facilitate scavenging by mesopredators and also by birds. And this could promote mesopredator release, which potentially could increase the populations of these species across the landscape, and also maybe even acclimate these animals to stealing more from the pumas, which could make them more problematic for the cats in the future. Now, previously we tended to think that release was the result only of extirpations of predators, but this suggests that actually there could be a whole other mechanism by which release might happen, that you just simply have a behavioral change in a predator and that allows the release to happen. And the scavengers could become more aggressive, and this could be a problem not just for the pumas, as I mentioned earlier, but potentially even for other animals in the area, or potentially even for humans if you're worried about maybe your pets getting attacked by these sorts of animals. And kills that are not eaten by larger scavengers and predators could promote the growth of microbiota, so things like fungi and bacteria and so on, which could be good or bad depending on the area, but certainly could be seen as an irritant to people and potentially create some tensions there. If people are finding lots of carcasses, this could be quite disconcerting, especially if sometimes those carcasses are pets, and pumas are known to take pets as well. So these sorts of changes in behaviors could have implications for kind of the goodwill, not just for the natural ecosystem, but for human-wildlife relationships in the area. So overall, what the study is showing is that behavioral responses can be quite important ecosystem drivers, even though they're often overlooked. And here, the behavior of pumas could have a significant impact on their own health and on their own reproductive success, particularly with the females, but also on mesopredator populations, so things like ravens or coyotes or foxes or other species like that. And the findings also suggest that although pumas seem to be doing all right in terms of numbers, there could actually be less obvious negative impacts of anthropogenic disturbance, particularly if high-density areas are acting as sinks. So it might be the case that these females that are unsuccessfully trying to breed in the dense areas, they're not really producing any young that will take over in those spots. And the high-density habitats are being filled by wandering individuals that have come in from outside and from more natural areas. And that's kind of the definition of a sink, is that you have to keep your population topped up by getting immigrants from elsewhere rather than being able to locally sustain your own population. And that can be quite problematic if at some point it's no longer possible for those immigrants to come in. So if there are lots of roads and lots more urban development, then suddenly the pumas might be cut off and their populations would dwindle in little pockets. Now, cumulatively, these patterns emphasize the need to do more than merely collect presence and absence data and abundance information when trying to assess the health of wildlife populations. And this is one of the things that I've always been really interested in, is the idea that rather than going out and doing counts, which are really useful in certain circumstances, but not in all circumstances, you instead would go out and watch what the animals are doing and think about how those behaviors would interact with some human variable to then figure out what's happening in these disturbed environments and whether it's good or bad for this sustenance, for the sustainability of the population. So that's all from me today. I hope you enjoyed learning a bit about pumas and about human-wildlife conflict. And this is actually something that's kind of increasingly of interest here in Europe as well, because we now at this time have more large predators than we have for hundreds of years actually. We have lots of these things coming back and increasing their populations. And so we might actually start to see some of these dynamics here in Europe as well, with bears and with lynx and other larger species. So keep an eye on that. That's all from me. So next week I will talk about some recent science news and get you up to speed. But for now, I will leave you in the hands of Monsters and Men with King and Lionheart.